Well, welcome to this talk, and especially a warm welcome to Professor Norman Fenton. Thanks for coming back, Norman.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again.
Now, you've identified a very interesting problem with the Office for National Statistics data, looking at mortality by vaccination status. Now, if you can just give us a couple of minutes intro on this, Norman, please, before we go and look at the detail and people can decide if they want to watch the whole video.
Yeah, so since July of 2021, i.e. when they were first getting in the data on mortality via vaccination status, the Office for National Statistics have been producing these reports every 2 months, actually, up until they stopped doing it in July of 2022. And we felt that these reports were really important because they were the first opportunity to be able to really determine the cost-benefit of the vaccines, because they would enable you to be able to see the all-cause mortality comparison between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. And that's important because if the vaccines are working well, and if with COVID is as deadly as claimed, if the vaccines are working well, then what we should be seeing, of course, is a higher all-cause mortality in the unvaccinated compared to the vaccinated. So technically, everything should have been there to be able to do that. The problem was, right from the beginning, there were sort of problems with the data in there. First of all, they didn't give the data by age category, right? So it was all this data that were given. It was very hard to use this sort of age confounding, and they weren't giving us the raw data. So we got back to them, and they were very good. They then gave us some data by age category, so that the reports got a bit better. But then we found that once they'd given us that, and we were able to do some more detailed analysis, we found all kinds of anomalies in the data. And there were so many reasons why it didn't make sense, okay? And there were also issues about the sample that they were using and the fact that it was not very representative of the whole of the England population. And yet people were using this data to make very strong claims about vaccine efficacy and safety, and we knew it to be fundamentally flawed. And the more it went on, the most recent report, as I say, was July 2022. When we analysed that, we found problems with there was a lot of misclassification of deaths. So, basically, the people who were dying shortly after vaccination were being classified as unvaccinated. There was a lot of missing deaths of people who were vaccinated, and there was an underrepresentation of people who were unvaccinated in the sample. So you're getting all these kinds of biases. So basically, we decided we were so unhappy with this that we'd had discussions with ONS. We weren't getting the answers that we needed. So we wrote to the Statistics Regulator. We actually put in a formal complaint in November of 2022. And we actually said, we highlighted, we pointed them to the detailed reports that we provided, and we summarised all of the key points. And we made 2 points. One was that it grossly underestimated the population proportion of unvaccinated. That was massively biased in the results. And we actually said in our letter to them, and I quote, that the data is so unreliable that it should stop being used. Nobody should use it anymore as a justification for the efficacy and safety of COVID vaccines. And we actually called for a retraction of any claims made by any others based on this data. Okay, so we were saying that anybody who'd made claims, like, for example, the BBC or lots of other people, but individual researchers as well as organisations, but any claims like that were unfounded because of the unreliability of the data. Anyway, on Friday, after 2 months, we eventually got the response from the Statistics Regulator. And surprisingly, and they've allowed us to, in fact, they are going to publish it. They actually asked if they could publish the response on their website. So this is all now in the public domain. And on 2 very, very key points, they absolutely agreed with us. They said they agreed that the sample that the ONS was using was not representative of the general population, and they explicitly said they agreed with us because it underrepresented those unvaccinated. There were far more unvaccinated, the portion of unvaccinated was underestimated in their sample. Far more people outside the sample were unvaccinated because they're more likely to be younger, etc. So that's the first point. They agreed with us on that, massive bias in the data set. But then critically, they actually stated, now I'll read out what they actually said, was that those reports do not provide information on vaccine effectiveness or vaccine safety and should not be used in this way, which is exactly what we were saying.
But they have been used in this way for ages.
They have. And the point that we've always argued anyway is that when you do a very kind of like careful adjustment for the biases, even with all of the problems in the data, even with all the flaws and missing data, there still, even though people claimed that gave evidence of sort of safety and efficacy, it actually wasn't there. There was no evidence that all-cause mortality was lower in the unvaccinated than the vaccinated.
So given this data, we actually don't know the degree to which vaccine has altered mortality, overall mortality in the United Kingdom.
No, we don't, and that's the problem, because if anybody, we were hoping this was going to be the sort of the gold data set, because the ONS are better than most other national organisations as far as recalling this data. In fact, as far as we know, they were the only ones even attempting to provide to the public some kind of breakdown of mortality by vaccination status, so it should have been there, but it's not. They're not. It's just the data is not showing us that evidence.
So we've got this massive natural experiment of who's vaccinated, how many vaccine doses they've had in the UK, whether they're vaccinated or not. All this data's there, but we simply don't know what the results are. It just seems a tragic waste of this massive natural experiment.
Yeah, we still don't know, which after 2 years the vaccine started to roll out in December 2020, so we're 2 years and, well over 2 years into it now. We should at least be able to answer these questions.
Now, the people that have made television programmes, written papers, done assumptions based on this data, which the Statistics Regulator now says we should not be using, once this is published in public domain, can we expect masses of retractions coming out in the next few weeks?
I'd like to think so, but I'm pessimistic as to whether we really will. We should also be seeing, incidentally, a very strong apology from the BBC, because as I think we discussed on a previous interview, they were making, when they made their documentary, Unvaccinated, they were stating that the proportion of unvaccinated, adult unvaccinated in England was only 8%. That was in May last year. And at that time, we said, and we knew, it was more than 20% once you took account for the bias in their sample based on other data, other samples. And we put this to the BBC, and we said, you cannot use that figure, you've got to retract it. And they, after many months they made other complaints about their programme, but they were adamant that that was the ONS figure and that was the best estimate. They kept saying that. Well, now we now know that the Stats Regulator is effectively saying that that is not the correct. That's nothing like the best estimate. It was underestimated, and they were using that figure almost to kind of like demean the unvaccinated. They were sort of making out there's some kind of a crazy fringe minority, smaller than what they actually were.
Mm-hmm. Well, good for the Stats Regulator then.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's what this video is about. We're now going to go and give the evidence and some detail on this that Norman's kindly put together for us. So if you're interested in this, do stick around because it is completely fascinating. So should we go into the first slide, Norman?
Yep.
What are we looking at?
So this is the latest report. So this report was published in July 2022, and it covers the whole period of the vaccination from 1st of January 2021 until until May, the end of May 2022. Now, the fact that we raised concerns about this at the time, and others did. They kept promising they were still going to update it in 2 months, as they had done, but they never did. This has never been updated. So I think that they were aware that this, there were that there really were continuing problems with these reports that they've never resolved. And you can see there on the right-hand side, those are the bi-monthly reports that they had been publishing before. So this was the latest one. So this is the one which we've done detailed analysis and published reports on ResearchGate of the previous reports, right? But this is the latest report, and there's a link there which presumably you can put in the description under the video as well if people want to actually see it.
Yeah.
So that's the report by the ONS that was the focus of our most recent analysis.
Yeah. Good to have that documented.
So if you can go on to
the headline comparison.
And this is the sort of the headline figures that people were using from that, right? So as I said, the key thing is people wanted to be able to know what is the difference in mortality rate amongst the all-cause mortality rate amongst the vaccinated and amongst the ever vaccinated, because there's lots of different categories of vaccination, which incidentally is another problem about the report, because there are lots of inconsistencies there between those categories. But you can classify them as ever vaccinated and never vaccinated, because to us that's the simplest thing.
Yeah.
Right? And if you look at just the raw all-cause mortality, not taking account of age of people, then the ever vaccinated actually have a much higher, actually over twice as high a mortality rate than the never vaccinated. Now, of course, anti-vaxxers, as they like to call people who raise concerns about vaccine safety, would look at that data and say, look at that, wow, the vaccines are killing people at twice the rate as the unvaccinated. So that's kind of like an argument which could be used by the anti-vaxxers. But of course, that data, if you just use that raw mortality data, it's what we call age confounded. Yes. Basically, deaths are disproportionately higher in older people. Obviously, older people is where most of the deaths are, and it's also the population where you've got the highest proportion of vaccinated people. So the younger people, who tend not to die, are the ones least likely to be vaccinated. So you've got this so-called age confounding effect. So what the Office for National Statistics do, and lots of organisations do this as a way of getting around this problem, is they use a statistic which is actually just a kind of a model in its own right, which is attempts to merge the data to take account of the different death rates in the different age categories. And so you end up with the so-called age standardised mortality metric. And when you do that, if you can show it again.
ASMR.
And when you do that, the age standardised mortality metric, it flips. In this case, now, in the ever vaccinated, that age standardised mortality rate is much lower in the ever vaccinated than the never vaccinated, which appears to be very, very strong evidence to support the efficacy of the vaccine. Okay, and that's what people have used. Now, there is a problem. I've never liked the use of this metric, because it's just a model. What we were always asking for, and never really properly given, was just give us the raw data in each of the different age categories. So we'd like to be able to see, the 10 to 14-year-olds, the 15 to 20-year-olds, etc., because then it wouldn't be age confounded, and we could look at them separately. And of course, that's what we want. Ideally, what do we want to know? We want to know, for each different age group, what are the cost benefits of having the vaccine. So it could well be the case that certain age groups, the evidence supports taking the vaccine, whereas in others the risks outweigh the benefits. So we were never properly happy with that, because this age standardised mortality metric simply doesn't allow you to do that. It's just not the right metric to be using to do that type of personalised risk assessment.
We've been asking for this individualised participant level data in all sorts of things all through the pandemic, haven't we? And we just don't seem to be getting it.
Yeah, I mean, they give reasons of, there's the anonymity problem. One of the reasons, I'd say they've always been very reluctant to give any kind of mortality data at the lower age ranges. They think that the mortality rate, the number of deaths is sufficiently low that people could be, and if you're giving it on a monthly basis, there might be enough in there to be able to identify who those actual deaths were in particular categories. I mean, I think that's an absolute nonsense, actually, but that was one of the reasons that was one of the main reasons they gave.
Yeah, on a national level.
Yeah, so the point is, when you then dig into the data carefully, right, and analyse this, right, you actually find reasons why that data can't possibly be an accurate reflection of the England population. And the easiest way to see that is actually to separate out the COVID mortality from the non-COVID mortality. So all-cause mortality is just the number of COVID deaths plus a number of non-COVID deaths. That's the all-cause mortality. So we can look separately, right, for the vaccinated and the unvaccinated at the non-COVID mortality and see what's happening there. And by doing that, that's where you see that this data is fundamentally flawed, that there's so many anomalies in it. So in our first two reports, so this was about we already picked these up in the previous ONS report. So first of all, we found that there was strong evidence that many of those dying shortly after vaccination were being misclassified as unvaccinated, and that's why you're getting this imbalance. And you find this when you concentrate on comparing the non-COVID mortality between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. Because why? Because there's no reason why, when you only focus on non-COVID deaths, why should the vaccinated and the unvaccinated be any significantly different? They should have about the same mortality. If anything, if there was even a small number of adverse reactions from the vaccine, you'd expect the non-COVID mortality to be a bit higher in the vaccinated than the unvaccinated. But at best, the best you can hope for is that it's not any lower. So they should be about the same, right? So that was one thing. That's a really key thing. That's still there, that problem. We also found in the next report, we also reported that there was this evidence that they were just undercounting deaths generally occurring within the first 2 weeks of vaccination. So it wasn't just a misclassification, they just weren't in the data set, right? They were missing. We know that those deaths were missing. So that's what came out of the previous report. But if you go to the next slide, I can just hone in on this key problem about the non-COVID mortality error here, because this is just one example. If you look at the 60 to 69 age group, and just plot from their data, this was in the week from weeks 1 to 38 of 2021, just plot the unvaccinated non-COVID mortality against the vaccinated no-COVID mortality. And as I said, those should be the same. Those plots should be about the same. There's no reason for them to be any different. And yet, what do you get? You get the unvaccinated mortality really peaking, just so happens to really peak at the same time when the vaccine rollout peaks. Now, if you think about it, this is mind-blowing. What it's basically saying is that the vaccine has some kind of really miraculous properties. It has the miraculous property of making people vaccinated not die from non-COVID illnesses. And it also has the miraculous property of somehow transferring, almost psychically somehow, the ability for unvaccinated people to suddenly start dying when the vaccinated are getting vaccinated at their peak. Right? So it doesn't make sense. And of course we showed that actually this type of weird anomaly always and inevitably occurs when you're simply misclassifying those who die shortly after vaccination as unvaccinated.
Yeah, this is evidence of misclassification. This is not evidence of protection of the vaccine against the all causes of death. This is simply misclassification.
Yeah, because this is only non-COVID deaths. There's no COVID. This has taken out all the COVID mortality. Right. So that was what we showed previously, and then if you go on to the next slide, I think this is the one where we look at the
ONS mortality.
Yeah, so now, finally we did the analysis of the newest data, and we found all of those problems, but we found more. We found even more evidence of this, of these anomalies with the misclassifications. So if you go on to the next, this is the one which is this is the most sort of detailed data, so I'll try and sort of talk through, there's the summary findings first, So, we found further evidence of misclassification, missing deaths. We found further evidence of the bias sample, which I already mentioned. But critically, we found that the mortality rates are nonsensical in various categories, and they're completely incompatible with historical rates. So that's the thing. I just want to show what I mean by that, because that's summarised in the data for that is in the next slide. Right, so what you've got here is the whole period mortality rates, and I can flag up, if you look at the right-hand column, there's the all-cause mortality, and there you can see, I've been put in grey, compared the unvaccinated at the top with the ever vaccinated, and you can see those figures, top right, the 2,338 mortality rate for the unvaccinated, whereas at the bottom you've got the ever vaccinated, this much lower rate at the bottom of 957. Now, that's the thing that I mentioned at the beginning. But of course, what happens when we just look at the non-COVID? This is the one that should be equal. Whatever that all-cause one, the non-COVID one should be the same. So in that middle column there, the non-COVID, even there you can see that the unvaccinated have a much higher rate than, that's 1474, the last but one column. Well, we just look at the age standardised mortality rates there. That column there, you can see that's much higher, again, in the unvaccinated than the ever vaccinated at the bottom. Right? Well, we know they should be roughly the same.
Yeah.
Now, if you click through, there's another little chart. There should be a couple of charts come up. If you click through, there's a click through on the slide. Yeah, so that's just highlight. Oh, listen, there's another thing highlighted here. This is interesting. It just shows you thanks. Right, that's all we need now. If you look at that second dose at least 6 months, the one that's highlighted somewhere in the middle of the table, you can see that for those people, weirdly, the non-COVID mortality is much higher than both the unvaccinated and the ever vaccinated. Overall, so you get these strange things. But here's the crux of it. That table on the right there is showing you the age standardised mortality rates, the historical data in pre-COVID times. And look how stable it is. Up until 2020, it's always around sort of an average of around 980 deaths per 100k person years. So that figure of about sort of between 900 and 1,000, that's what you should be seeing. That's what you should be seeing in all the way down that middle column of non-COVID, the last but one column in the big table. They should all be around sort of 900 to 1,000. It should be about 950. Because there's no reason it should be any different to pre-COVID times. This is non-COVID mortality. But look at that ridiculous range. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And that just proves that data cannot be relied on because of these misclassification problems and missing deaths. That's, to us, is the ultimate proof. So the next slide, I think, just shows you what we wrote to the Stats Regulator, I believe. Yeah, that's our letter of complaint to the Stats Regulator. That will be online. There'll be a web page for that, and you can see I've highlighted those key points about the problems with the underestimated, the proportion unvaccinated, and the fact that the data is just so unreliable that any claims made about vaccine safety or efficacy based on it should be retracted. That's basically what we were asking for. And then the next slide is this is just a screenshot of their response. Thank you. Yeah, so they do say that it's taken time to respond. They apologise because they were important issues and they had to look at them carefully, which I think they did. So just then, a shout out. Just as I'm speaking now, my colleague Martin Mills just sent me a signal message to make sure that we give him an acknowledgement for his work on this. Martin, you're mentioned there, and you're pinging so loudly that I better turn the phone off. So that was actually good timing of his there. So. And then the next page. So it's quite a long letter they sent, but I picked out the key points on the next page. And those are the ones I said. That's where they agree with us. They agree with us that you can't use that sample is biased. It underrepresents the proportion of unvaccinated. That's the first point. And the second point, which is the critical one, they agree with us that you simply cannot use that data to make to draw any conclusions about vaccine efficacy or safety. So there was just one other point. But there was one thing they didn't agree with us on, where they kind of like came on the side of the Office for National Statistics, and that's this thing about the healthy vaccine effects, right? This is what everybody says, everything, all the problems, all the anomalies can be explained by what they call the healthy vaccine effect hypothesis, right? And so the ONS were claiming this, and the regulator, were very careful to side with the ONS. They didn't want to. They went to extreme lengths actually to defend the integrity of the Office for National Statistics, and we never questioned the integrity of the Office for National Statistics anyway. We were questioning the integrity of the data that got to the Office for National Statistics and what they, where that data is coming from and how it gets corrupted, and lost before it gets to them. That's a problem. Okay, but what does this healthy vaccine effect actually mean? What are they claiming here, and why do they claim this kind of explains a lot of the anomalies? Well, they claim that part of it assumes either or both of the following: that people close to death, you can think of as the moribund, they call them. I don't like that expression. That's what they refer them to. People who are moribund at the time that their age group get the vaccine rolled out are actually denied the vaccine. They claim that, and that's why you get this. They claim that's when you might see these peaks in non-COVID mortality in each age group when the vaccine's being rolled out to that age group, right? But there's a problem. It doesn't work. That doesn't make sense, because we know that's actually inconsistent with the NHS guidelines, who are actually prioritising the least healthy, the most moribund, if you like, to get vaccinated. And we know we've got actually. When I say real evidence, we've got anecdotal evidence from actual people working in care homes. We know that those close to death were prioritised, because they were worried that if they got COVID, it would be a much more horrible death than they might have suffered otherwise. So they were giving them the vaccine to avoid the horrible COVID deaths. And in any case, it doesn't make any sense from a theoretical perspective, because you can't model, you can't even replicate the kind of peaks that you're seeing, right? Because it would require us to somehow be able to know, through the year when there are going to be these peaks of moribund people. It doesn't work like that. They don't peak. Moribunds don't peak. You get it through the year. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the other point was that then you've got the genuine healthy vaccine effect, which is the hypothesis that the healthiest people are somehow, they're the most tuned in to what's best for them, and they're the ones getting more likely to get the vaccine than the unhealthy people, right? Now, even if that was true, even if it was true, there might be some truth in that, right? It doesn't explain the anomalies and the peaks. And even if it was true, what it means is that there's another systematic bias in the ONS data which they haven't adjusted for, namely the healthy vaccine effect. And again, it all leads to the same conclusion. You therefore cannot trust the data that is coming from, that you get from them without those adjustments. So yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah. Is this just a series of mistakes, Norman, or is there something? Who is the? I mean, the Office for National Statistics. I've always thought they were the absolute bee's knees of statistics. Are people
giving
them inaccurate data, and how is that coming about?
there's part of that, but I believe there might be something else. There might be something else going on here, which is to do with the fact, why haven't we seen the update since July 2022, which is that, in fact, why haven't we seen the update? Remember that the mortality figures there were only up till May 2022. So we're now, we've now got no mortality by vaccine status data for whatever it is, about 8 months, 7 or 8 months. Got none. Okay? Now, here's something that we also found in the most recent report. Because there was far fewer vaccinations, new vaccinations taking place, let's say, after February 2022, do you know what we were seeing in the actual raw data between February 2022 and May 22 in the raw mortality data? What do you think we were seeing?
Well, we were getting less.
Allowed to say, I don't know.
We were getting less people vaccinated, weren't we?
Yeah, we're getting less people vaccinated, which means there's less chance to introduce the misclassification errors. What were we seeing in terms of the raw data on deaths?
The deaths were going back to what you'd expect in
previous
years.
ONS's own data, without any adjustments, we were seeing in the younger age groups higher mortality rate in the vaccinated and unvaccinated.
This is interesting.
We're also seeing it, incidentally, we're also seeing it in the oldest, in the 90-plus age group, right? And it was getting, as the months were going on, they were getting, it was getting further away from the hypothesis that the all-cause mortality would be reduced in the vaccinated.
This is actually quite frightening, because I looked at the data.
That's even without taking any account of the bias in the underestimation of the unvaccinated.
I was looking at the Society of Actuaries. Yeah, the Society of Actuaries published their data yesterday. In 2022, there was 8.6% more higher levels of excess deaths in the 20 to 44-year-olds than there was in the same period in 2019.
Yeah.
8.6% increase in deaths in the 20 to 44-year-olds. That is huge.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the hypothesis, people have said, we've never said this.
We're not saying anything, but there is a temporal correlation.
And also people are saying that maybe the reason why there's been no update to this mortality by vaccination status since May 2022 is that maybe because there has been that similar progression of what we were seeing in the few months just before that.
Well, let's hope that's not true,
that's
Norman.
Not for me,
Let's hope that's not true.
Let's hope it's not true.
The point is, these things are so complicated for people like me. I couldn't work all this out. We need people like you to do this, which is why we need this independent peer review of these government agencies, because quite honestly, I don't trust government agencies anymore. Simple as that.
Yeah, no, I don't.
That's simple. I did at the start of this pandemic, and this is one of the great disillusionments that we need independent peer review, which thankfully people of you and similar levels of ability are providing. So we're very grateful for that, Norman. So thank you. Thanks. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of effort. Check out Professor Fenton's Substack. With who's your co-operator on that, Norman?
With Martin Mill.
Yep. Check it out. We'll put the links.
We can put the links. Yeah.
Yeah. So Norman, thank you so much. I'm going to watch that through again, make sure I've got it all. quite difficult material, but fundamental questions, and it has to be said, fundamental flaws that need to be corrected, and a lot of retrospective corrections need to be made now that we know we can't use this data in the way this data has been used.
Yeah.
And I look forward to those, perhaps starting with I'm sure the BBC will do that next week as soon as they get the new data. Unless they don't, let's see.
Them a message.
Okay, do that. Thank you, Norman. Really appreciate it. And
thanks a lot.
Talk soon. Bye. That's great, Norman. I understood that.